The morning sun shone brightly over the small town of Willow Creek. The roads were quiet, with only a few cars passing by and the sound of birds echoing through the open fields. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and news traveled faster than the wind. On that bright Monday morning, something new was about to happen at Willow Creek Elementary School. A new student was joining the class. His name was Caleb Johnson, a quiet, polite 12-year-old boy who had just moved to town with his family. His father worked long hours on their small farm, and his mother helped sell vegetables and milk in the local market. Caleb was used to waking up early, sometimes before sunrise, to help feed the animals and carry buckets of water from the well. Life on the farm was not easy, but he loved it. It made him strong, patient, and thankful for small things. That morning, Caleb put on his cleanest shirt, a faded blue one that used to belong to his cousin, and carefully packed his old school bag. His mother brushed his hair with her fingers, kissed his forehead, and said softly, "Remember, Caleb, be kind. Learn all you can. You're smart, even if others can't see it right away." He nodded with a shy smile and walked toward the school bus, clutching his lunchbox. When the bus stopped at the school, Caleb stepped out, looking around at the big building and the group of children chatting loudly near the entrance. He could feel his heart beating fast. Everyone seemed to know each other. They laughed, played, and shared stories while he stood quietly by himself, unsure what to do. Inside the classroom, the teacher, Mrs. Parker, stood at the front. She was known for being strict and serious. Her sharp eyes scanned the class as the students settled down. When Caleb entered, she paused and gave him a quick look from head to toe. His clothes looked simple and a bit old, his shoes dusty from the dirt road. She asked in a flat tone, "You must be the new student. What's your name?" "Caleb Johnson, ma'am," he said softly. "All right, Caleb, you can sit in the back," she replied, pointing toward an empty seat near the window. The class giggled quietly. A few students whispered things like farm boy and country kid, but Mrs. Parker didn't say anything. Caleb pretended not to hear. He sat down, opened his notebook, and listened carefully as the lesson began. Throughout the morning, Mrs. Parker asked several questions to the class. Hands shot up quickly. Caleb wanted to answer, but he was too shy. When she finally asked a question about history that he knew, he slowly raised his hand. Mrs. Parker looked surprised, but nodded for him to speak. Caleb gave the correct answer, clear and confident. The class went silent for a moment. Mrs. Parker raised an eyebrow. "Did someone tell you the answer?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Caleb replied. "I read it in the book you gave us." Her tone turned cold. We'll see about that." Then she moved on to the next question without saying anything more. Caleb lowered his head, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. At recess, Caleb sat alone under a tree, eating his sandwich while the other kids played basketball. A friendly girl named Mia came over and asked, "Why did you move here?" "My dad got a small piece of land outside town. We have cows and chickens now," Caleb said with a smile. "That's cool," Mia said, genuinely impressed. But before they could talk more, another boy, Jake, joined in and said loudly, "So you're a farmer now? Do you bring cow poop to school too?" The group around him laughed. Mia frowned and walked away. Caleb didn't say anything. He just looked down at his lunch and took another bite, pretending not to care. When the bell rang, he went back to class. But now he felt different, not just shy, but invisible. He noticed how the teacher smiled at some students and ignored him. When others made small mistakes, she laughed and corrected them kindly. But when Caleb dropped his pencil, she sighed loudly, saying, "Try to be careful, Caleb." The hours felt long. He looked out the window, watching the clouds move slowly over the fields, wishing he was back home helping his dad instead. School didn't feel like a place where he belonged. When the final bell rang, Caleb quietly packed his bag. Mrs. Parker didn't say goodbye or even look at him. He walked out alone, kicking small stones on the road. The laughter of other children followed him, fading as he got farther away. At home, his mother smiled when she saw him. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" she asked. Caleb forced a small smile and said, "It was okay, Mama." He didn't want her to worry. He changed his clothes, fed the chickens, and helped his father fix the fence. The sky turned orange as the sun went down, and the wind carried the smell of fresh hay. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, his grandfather, Mr. Samuel Johnson, joined them. He had strong hands, a calm voice, and eyes that noticed everything. When Caleb stayed quiet, his grandfather asked gently, "Something wrong, son?" Caleb hesitated, but then shook his head. "Nothing, Grandpa. Just tired." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly but said nothing more. Deep down, he knew something had happened. He looked at Caleb for a long moment and thought to himself, "Tomorrow we'll see who really understands respect." That night, Caleb went to bed early. The moonlight streamed through the window and he whispered to himself, "Maybe tomorrow will be better." He didn't know that the next morning would change everything, and for him, for his teacher, and for the entire school. The next morning began quietly, but the air felt different. Caleb woke up before sunrise, as always, to help his father with the chores. The smell of hay and the sound of roosters filled the air. He washed his hands, ate a quick breakfast, and put on his neatly pressed shirt, the same one from yesterday. His mother smiled softly and said, "Hold your head high today, Caleb. Remember, no one can take away what's inside you." Caleb nodded, his eyes shining with hope. He wanted to believe that maybe today would be better. When he reached school, he walked through the hallways with quiet confidence. A few students looked at him and whispered again, but he ignored them. He sat in his usual seat by the window and opened his notebook, ready to learn. Mrs. Parker entered the room with her usual serious face. She carried a stack of papers in one arm and a cup of coffee in the other. "Good morning, class," she said sharply. "We'll start today with some revision from yesterday's lesson." The students groaned softly, but she ignored them. "Let's see who remembers what we talked about," she continued, scanning the room. "Who can tell me when the Civil Rights Act was passed?" Hands went up. Caleb hesitated, then raised his hand too. Mrs. Parker noticed, but chose another student first. "Jake." Jake gave a wrong answer, but Mrs. Parker smiled slightly and said, "Close, but not quite." Then, after a pause, she looked at Caleb. "All right, Caleb," she said, folding her arms. "You seem confident. Let's hear your answer." Caleb spoke clearly. "It was passed in 1964, ma'am." The room went silent. Mrs. Parker's eyebrows lifted a little. "That's correct," she said slowly, then added, "Did someone help you with that?" Caleb blinked, confused. "No, ma'am. I studied it last night," her lips tightened. "Interesting," she said, in a tone that sounded more doubtful than impressed. "Let's see if you really studied." She began asking him more questions, harder ones, faster. Caleb tried to answer each one, his voice steady but nervous. He got most of them right. A few classmates looked impressed. Others smirked, waiting for him to make a mistake. Finally, on one question, he hesitated. Mrs. Parker immediately snapped, "See? You're just guessing. You don't really understand this, do you?" The class giggled. Caleb's face turned red. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "I wasn't guessing. I just needed a second to remember." "Enough," Mrs. Parker interrupted, her tone sharp. "If you can't keep up, don't waste our time. Maybe you should focus on your farm instead of pretending to know everything." The laughter grew louder. Caleb froze in his seat. He wanted to disappear. Every word hit him like a stone. He looked down at his notebook, blinking back tears. He could hear some students whisper, "Farm boys embarrassed. Should have stayed in the barn." Mrs. Parker turned back to the board as if nothing had happened. "Let's move on," she said coldly. The rest of the lesson felt like a blur. Caleb's hands trembled as he tried to write notes. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't angry, just hurt. He had worked hard, studied late into the night, and still it wasn't enough. When the bell finally rang, he stayed in his seat, hoping the others would leave first. But Jake and his friends walked by, laughing. "Hey, genius farmer," Jake said with a grin. "Maybe next time bring some milk for the teacher." Caleb said nothing. He simply packed his bag and walked out quietly. Outside, the sky was cloudy and the wind had picked up. The schoolyard felt colder than usual. He walked along the dirt road that led to his home, kicking small stones as he went. His shoes were dusty, his shoulders heavy. By the time he reached home, his mother was hanging clothes on the line. She looked up and immediately noticed his expression. "What happened, Caleb?" she asked gently. He tried to smile. "Nothing, Mama, just a hard day," but she knew. A mother always knows. She didn't press further. She simply said, "Come inside. There's warm soup." At the dinner table, his father talked about fixing the tractor, and his mother told him about new seedlings. Caleb listened quietly, pretending to eat. When his grandfather arrived a bit later, he immediately sensed the tension. Mr. Samuel Johnson, tall, calm, with silver hair and a gentle but commanding presence, took a seat beside Caleb. "How was school today, son?" he asked, looking directly into his eyes. Caleb hesitated. "It was fine, Grandpa," he said softly. Mr. Johnson didn't believe him. He murmured, leaning back. "Fine doesn't sound fine." There was silence for a while. Then Caleb finally spoke. His voice cracked as he said, "Grandpa, why do people judge so fast? My teacher doesn't like me. She said I should stick to farming." Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't get angry. He rarely did, but there was a fire behind his calm expression. "She said that, did she?" he asked. Caleb nodded. The old man placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Listen to me, Caleb. People who look down on others often forget that respect is something you earn, not something you demand. Tomorrow I'll come to your school." Caleb looked up in surprise.
"Why, Grandpa?"
Mr. Johnson smiled faintly. "Let's just say your teacher is about to learn a small lesson, one she won't forget." Caleb didn't fully understand what his grandfather meant. But that night, as he lay in bed, he imagined what might happen. He didn't know that the next morning the sound of helicopter blades would echo through the schoolyard, and that his quiet world was about to change forever. The last bell of the day rang. But for Caleb, it didn't sound like freedom. It sounded like a clock ticking too loud in an empty room. While other students rushed out laughing, throwing paper balls and shouting plans for the evening, Caleb stayed behind for a few seconds, slowly packing his notebook into his worn-out bag. The classroom that had felt too small all day suddenly felt enormous. The echo of Mrs. Parker's words replayed in his head like a broken record. "Maybe farming suits you better." He could still hear the soft laughter of the class, the way Jake had smirked, the way Mrs. Parker hadn't even looked at him afterward. He took a deep breath, stood up, and quietly walked out. The hallway was almost empty now, filled only with the distant squeak of a janitor's mop and the faint buzz of old ceiling lights. As he walked past the notice boards, his reflection flickered in the glass. Small, tired, and carrying more weight than any 12-year-old should. Outside, the world was calm again. The sky was a soft mix of orange and pink, the kind of evening that made everything look golden for a few minutes before the sun disappeared. Caleb began the long walk home, his bag heavy on his shoulder, his shoes kicking at stones along the dusty road. With every step, the noise of the school faded away, replaced by the sounds of the countryside, birds calling, the soft whistle of wind through tall grass, and the faint mooing of cows in the distance. Normally he liked this walk. It gave him time to think, to dream. But today it felt endless. He passed the old oak tree near the stream, the one where he used to rest sometimes. He stopped for a moment and sat on a fallen log, staring at his reflection in the water. "Maybe she's right," he whispered to himself. "Maybe I don't belong there." He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water. Ripples spread across the surface, blurring his reflection, just like his thoughts. He remembered how his mother had encouraged him that morning, how his grandfather had told him to be strong. He wanted to make them proud, to show that a farm kid could be smart too. But now, after just 2 days, he already felt like giving up. The road home stretched far ahead, but as he walked, he began to hear something comforting. The faint clucking of chickens and the barking of the farm dog, Duke. That sound always made him feel safe. When he reached the gate, his mother was there, hanging clothes on the line. She turned, her face lighting up. "You're home, sweetheart. How was school today?" Caleb forced a smile. "It was okay," he said quickly, walking past her before she could ask more. But mothers always know. She watched him carefully as he went straight to the barn instead of coming inside. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and earth surrounded him. He sat on a wooden crate, staring at the light coming through the cracks in the walls. Dust particles floated in the sunlight like tiny stars. Duke, their brown and white dog, walked over and rested his head on Caleb's knee. Caleb smiled weakly and patted him. "At least you don't laugh at me," he whispered. After a few minutes, he heard footsteps behind him. It was his grandfather, Mr. Samuel Johnson, carrying his old leather hat in one hand. "I thought I'd find you here," the old man said with a soft chuckle. Caleb didn't turn around. "I just needed some quiet, Grandpa." Mr. Johnson sat down beside him, Quiet's good, he said, but it's even better when you talk about what's eating you inside. Caleb hesitated. His voice was low when he finally spoke. She made fun of me in front of everyone. My teacher. She said I should stick to farming. Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened, though his tone stayed calm. Did she now? Caleb nodded, and everyone laughed. I tried my best, Grandpa. I studied hard, but it didn't matter. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle creaking of the barn door in the wind. Then Mr. Johnson said quietly, Son, people sometimes see dirt on your shoes and forget to notice the gold in your heart. Caleb looked up, surprised by the words. His grandfather smiled kindly. You come from a line of people who worked the soil, who grew life from the earth. There's honor in that, and there's power too. Some folks won't see it until they're reminded. He stood up, brushing dust off his pants. Tell me, Caleb, do you trust me? Of course, Grandpa. Caleb replied instantly. Good, Mr. Johnson said with a thoughtful nod. Then don't worry about tomorrow. Just go to school as usual. I'll take care of the rest. Caleb blinked, confused. What do you mean, Grandpa? Mr. Johnson gave a small smile. That quiet, mysterious kind that always meant he had a plan. Let's just say, some lessons are better taught from the sky. Caleb didn't understand at first, but he saw the determination in his grandfather's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen when his grandfather talked about flying helicopters in the Air Force or starting their family farm from nothing. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the air felt different. Mr. Johnson ate quietly, occasionally glancing at the old phone sitting on the table. When the meal was over, he made one call, short and calm. Later that night, Caleb lay in bed staring at the stars outside his window. The moonlight fell across his face as he whispered to himself, Maybe tomorrow will really be different. Outside, his grandfather stood by the porch, hands behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. In the stillness of the night, he said softly, Tomorrow, they'll learn that respect can land anywhere, even on a schoolyard. And as the wind rustled through the fields, a faint smile crossed his face because by morning, the sky above Willow Creek Elementary would no longer be silent. That night, the farm was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of soft wind and starlight. Crickets chirped. The cows rested in their stalls and the smell of fresh hay drifted through the air. But inside the farmhouse, one man couldn't sleep. Mr. Samuel Johnson sat by the living room window, the soft glow of a lamp lighting the wrinkles on his weathered face. In his hands was an old photo, a younger version of himself standing beside a helicopter wearing his Air Force uniform. His eyes stayed fixed on that picture, but his mind was far away, back in that classroom, with his grandson sitting small and silent at a desk, being humiliated for something he could never change. He had seen many things in his life, storms, war, failure, victory. But what hurt him most tonight was seeing disrespect handed to a child who had done nothing wrong. The clock ticked softly. Caleb's mother peeked in and whispered, Dad, it's late. You should rest. Mr. Johnson didn't look up. I will, he said quietly. Just thinking. Thinking about what? She asked. He smiled faintly. About teaching someone a lesson, not with anger but with truth. She knew that tone. It was the same calm confidence he had when he was planning something important. So she simply nodded and said, Don't go too hard on them, Papa. He chuckled softly. Don't worry. I'll let the sky do the talking. The next morning came early. Caleb woke up before dawn again, expecting another ordinary day. He dressed quietly, brushed his teeth, and packed his books. His heart still felt heavy, but he reminded himself of what his grandfather had said. Some lessons are better taught from the sky. He didn't really understand what that meant, but he trusted his grandfather completely. When he came downstairs, the table was set for breakfast, but Mr. Johnson wasn't there. Only his mother and father sat quietly, exchanging small, knowing looks. Where's Grandpa? Caleb asked. His father smiled slightly. He had some errands to run early this morning. Caleb nodded, though he noticed his mother's smile was a little too mysterious. After breakfast, he left for school as usual. The dirt road felt softer beneath his shoes, the air cooler than usual. But far above, in the distance where the morning sun touched the clouds, something was already moving. Something with blades spinning and a purpose rising with it. Back at the farm, Mr. Johnson stood beside a large silver helicopter, its metal shining in the early light. It wasn't military anymore. Now it was painted with his company's logo, Johnson Agritech, a business that had grown from a small family farm into one of the region's largest agricultural firms. The pilot, an old friend from his Air Force days, stood beside him grinning. "You sure about this, Sam?" Mr. Johnson adjusted his aviator glasses and replied calmly, "Absolutely. Time to make an appearance," the pilot laughed. "I guess the school's not going to forget this one." As the engine started, the sound of the rotors grew louder, cutting through the morning silence. Birds scattered from the nearby trees. The wind whipped across the field, bending the tall grass. And within moments, the helicopter lifted gracefully into the air, rising toward Willow Creek Elementary. Meanwhile, at school, Mrs. Parker was writing on the chalkboard when the faint hum of something unusual began to fill the air. At first, students thought it was thunder, but the sound grew louder, rhythmic, powerful, and steady. Children rushed to the windows. "Is that a helicopter?" one shouted. Mrs. Parker frowned, setting down her chalk. "Everyone, please stay calm. It's probably just flying over." But the sound didn't fade. It grew louder. The windows trembled slightly and papers fluttered on desks. Then, as the noise became overwhelming, every head in the classroom turned toward the schoolyard. And there it was. A sleek helicopter, silver and shining, was slowly descending onto the open field behind the school. The ground shook lightly and dust swirled in circles as the students screamed in excitement. Teachers from nearby classrooms ran to the windows. "Who's landing a helicopter here?" Mrs. Parker shouted, her eyes wide in disbelief. Outside, the helicopter touched down gently. The blades slowed and the door opened. Out stepped Mr. Samuel Johnson, tall, calm, wearing his gray suit and dark sunglasses. His posture was straight, his presence commanding. Students gasped. Teachers whispered. And right then, Caleb, sitting near the window, froze. His eyes widened in shock, and then, slowly, a smile began to spread across his face. "Grandpa?" he whispered. Back on the field, Mr. Johnson began walking toward the school doors with quiet confidence. The principal hurried outside, looking both impressed and nervous. "Sir, is there an emergency?" Mr. Johnson smiled kindly. "No emergency. Just a lesson." Inside the classroom, Mrs. Parker tried to compose herself, but her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't sure what was happening, but something told her this wasn't a normal visit. When the door opened, all the noise stopped. Every student went silent. Mr. Johnson stood at the doorway, his gaze calm but powerful. His eyes found Caleb instantly, the boy who had been laughed at the day before. He smiled softly and said, "Good morning, young man." Caleb could barely speak. "Morning, Grandpa." Mrs. Parker swallowed hard. "You're his grandfather?" "Yes," he replied smoothly. "I thought I'd come and see the place where my grandson is being taught." He looked around the room, his voice polite but his presence overwhelming. "May I have a few minutes to speak with the class?" Mrs. Parker hesitated, unsure what to do. The principal, standing behind Mr. Johnson, nodded quickly. "Of course, sir, please." And as Mr. Johnson stepped inside, the students leaned forward, knowing something unforgettable was about to happen. A moment that would turn an ordinary school day into a story they'd tell for years. The air inside the classroom felt heavy, like everyone had forgotten how to breathe. The students sat frozen in their chairs, eyes wide, hearts racing. Outside, the helicopter's blades were still turning slowly, slicing through the morning light like giant silver wings. Dust danced in the air, sunlight flickered through the windows, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with chalk dust. Mr. Samuel Johnson stood tall at the front of the room, his polished shoes leaving faint marks on the old wooden floor. His presence was calm but commanding, the kind of calm that made everyone listen even before he spoke. Mrs. Parker's face had lost its usual color. Her lips pressed together tightly as she fidgeted with the chalk in her hand. Caleb, sitting in the back, watched quietly, unsure what to feel. Pride, shock, or fear. Mr. Johnson turned to the class and smiled. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Samuel Johnson. I believe you all know my grandson, Caleb." All eyes shifted toward Caleb. He felt 1,000 stares pressing on him, but this time, something inside him didn't shrink. For the first time, he lifted his chin a little. Mr. Johnson continued, "I came here today not to cause trouble, but to share something important. You see, sometimes when people don't understand where someone comes from, they forget to see who they really are." He looked around the room, his voice steady and warm. I grew up not far from here. My father was a farmer. We had little, just enough to survive. But my father taught me that the soil beneath our feet doesn't make us small. It teaches us strength. And strength, he paused, letting the silence stretch, can take you higher than you ever imagined. Even to the skies. The class listened spellbound. Mrs. Parker tried to smile politely. That's very inspiring, Mr. Johnson, she said softly. But he held up his hand gently. Please, ma'am, I'm almost done. His tone wasn't rude. It was respectful, but it carried authority, the kind that came from experience, not position. He turned back to the class. I joined the Air Force when I was 18. I learned to fly helicopters, serve my country, and later I built my own company from the same soil people once looked down on. Every bit of success I earned grew from the same dirt my father used to plow. His eyes softened as he looked at Caleb. And now, my grandson, another farm boy, sits here, trying to learn, to grow, to build something of his own. Yet yesterday someone decided he wasn't good enough. The class shifted uncomfortably. The silence was thick. Mrs. Parker's hands trembled slightly as she set the chalk down. Mr. Johnson continued, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. Children learn from the way they are treated. If you plant seeds of doubt, they'll grow into fear. But if you plant faith and respect, they'll grow into greatness. He took a slow breath. So I ask all of you, teachers, students, never to laugh at someone because of where they come from. Because one day you might find that the same person you look down on is the one flying higher than you could ever imagine. For a long moment, no one spoke. The words hung in the air like sunlight through glass. Then something unexpected happened. Jake, the boy who used to mock Caleb, raised his hand quietly. Sir, he said nervously, I didn't know you were a pilot. That's really cool. Mr. Johnson smiled. Thank you, son. But remember, it's not about being a pilot. It's about respecting people before you know who they are. Jake nodded, looking down at his desk. Mrs. Parker finally stood up, her face red with emotion. Mr. Johnson, she said softly, I owe you and Caleb an apology. I was wrong. I let my assumptions guide me instead of my heart. Mr. Johnson turned toward her. His voice remained kind. We all make mistakes, ma'am. The only real mistake is not learning from them. She nodded slowly, her eyes glassy. You're right, she whispered. Then she turned to Caleb. Caleb, I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I see now how unfair I was. You didn't deserve that. Caleb swallowed hard, unsure what to say. He simply nodded and murmured, It's okay, ma'am. Mr. Johnson smiled gently and placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. See, son? Respect. It doesn't need shouting. It just needs courage. Outside, the students had gathered near the windows again, staring in awe at the helicopter sitting proudly in the schoolyard. Some took pictures, others whispered excitedly. It wasn't every day that a farm boy's grandfather landed a helicopter at their school. Mr. Johnson glanced out the window, then looked back at the class. I should be going, he said, adjusting his glasses. But before I do, remember this. Greatness doesn't come from where you start. It comes from how you rise. He shook the principal's hand, nodded politely to Mrs. Parker, and walked out. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly in the hallway. Caleb followed him outside, and when they reached the field, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the scene in golden warmth. As the helicopter blades began to spin again, dust swirled around them. Mr. Johnson leaned close and said, Keep your head high, Caleb. The world will always test you. But you've already passed the hardest part. Caleb smiled for real this time. Thank you, Grandpa. The old man winked. See you at dinner, pilot. And as the helicopter lifted off, rising into the sky with a roar that everyone in the schoolyard could feel in their chest, every eye followed it upward, amazed, silent, and full of respect. From that day on, no one called Caleb Farm Boy again, because sometimes it only takes one man's courage and one unforgettable landing to remind the world what true dignity looks like. The school field was still swirling with dust as the helicopter's blades slowed down and finally stopped spinning. The students who had gathered outside now stood quietly, as if they were afraid to break the spell that had fallen over the place. The once busy playground was now a scene no one would forget. The day a farm kid's grandfather descended from the sky. Inside the building, whispers ran down the hallways like a sudden wind. Did you see it? That's Caleb's grandfather! He's so cool. He came in a helicopter. Every word carried both shock and awe. But in the middle of all that noise, Mrs. Parker stood frozen by the classroom door, clutching her lesson plan like it might steady her trembling hands. She could feel something heavy in her chest, not fear exactly, but shame. The same student she had doubted, dismissed, and humiliated had a grandfather who was everything she'd ever taught her students to admire. Strong, wise, successful, and deeply grounded. The principal hurried toward her, still trying to compose himself. Mrs. Parker, Mr. Johnson would like to address your class. She nodded quickly, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Yes, of course, she whispered. When Mr. Johnson entered the classroom again, the air changed instantly. The students straightened in their seats. His presence was calm yet powerful, not the kind that comes from money or fame, but the kind built from a lifetime of experience. He looked around the room slowly, his eyes kind but sharp, his voice deep and steady. Good morning again, everyone, he began. I want to thank you all for letting me visit. No one moved. The silence was complete. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, he continued. I'm here to tell you a story, a true one. He took off his sunglasses and set them gently on the teacher's desk. When I was your age, I was just like my grandson, Caleb. I used to come to school with dirt on my boots and hands rough from helping my father in the fields. My teacher back then looked at me the same way some people look at farm kids, like we were meant for work, not books. A few students shifted in their seats, their eyes downcast. Mr. Johnson smiled faintly. But my father told me something that changed my life. He said, son, you don't have to shine to be gold. I didn't understand it at first, but I learned that worth isn't about how you look, where you come from, or what you wear. It's about what you do with what you have. He paused, letting the words settle. Years later, I joined the Air Force. I worked hard, earned my wings, and learned to fly helicopters. I flew rescue missions, saved lives, and saw the world. But every time I looked down from the sky, I remembered that little boy in muddy boots who nobody believed in. He turned toward Caleb, who sat at the back, eyes shining. And that's why I came here today. Not to show off, but to remind this school and everyone in it that you never truly know someone's story just by looking at them. The classroom was utterly still. Even Mrs. Parker's eyes were glistening now. Mr. Johnson continued softly. Caleb told me what happened yesterday. How he was told to stick to farming. How he was laughed at. And that's okay, because sometimes people make mistakes. But what matters is what you do after you realize you were wrong. He looked at Mrs. Parker now, not with anger, but with compassion. Ma'am, I know teaching isn't easy. It's a hard job, but it's also one of the most powerful jobs in the world. What you say to a child can either build a bridge or a wall. I came here today hoping we can build a few more bridges. The teacher took a step forward, her eyes wet. Mr. Johnson, she said softly, her voice trembling. You're absolutely right. I was wrong. I judged Caleb before I knew him. I let my bias speak louder than my heart. She turned toward the class, her expression open and humble. And I want everyone here to learn from my mistake. Don't ever let someone's background fool you into thinking you know their potential. Caleb sat frozen, hardly believing what he was hearing. The class turned to him, some smiling shyly, some whispering his name. He felt warmth spread in his chest, not pride exactly, but relief. Like the heavy stone he'd been carrying finally lifted. Mr. Johnson nodded approvingly. That's all I wanted to hear, ma'am, he said kindly. Not for me, for Caleb and for every kid who's ever been made to feel small. He turned to the students one last time. You all have different stories, different homes, different struggles. But remember this. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you can't see. So be kind, be curious, and most of all, be fair. A few students began to clap softly. Then the entire room joined in, the sound rising like a wave, not because it was a performance, but because it was real. It was a moment of understanding, of change, of light breaking through an old habit of ignorance. Mr. Johnson smiled humbly and said, All right, I think that's enough talking from an old man. The bell rang, but no one moved. Everyone stayed seated as if they didn't want the moment to end. As Mr. Johnson turned to leave, Caleb stood up. Grandpa? He called softly. Mr. Johnson turned. Thank you, Caleb said simply. The old man's eyes softened. No, son, he replied. Thank you for reminding them, and me, that respect still matters. And as he walked out of the classroom, his boots tapping against the polished floor, every student who had once whispered farm boy now looked at Caleb differently, not with pity, but with admiration. As the applause faded, the air inside the classroom stayed heavy with meaning. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was peaceful, deep, almost sacred. Every student, even the ones who usually joked during lessons, sat perfectly still. Mr. Johnson stood near the window, sunlight falling across his silver hair. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He simply looked out at the schoolyard, the same field where his helicopter rested like a great bird, still and proud. The sound of the blades clicking softly in the distance felt like the heartbeat of the moment. Finally, he turned around, his eyes warm and wise. "Before I leave," he said softly, "I want to share something with you all. Not as a businessman, not as a pilot, but as a man who's lived long enough to understand what respect really means." The students leaned in. Even the principal, who had stepped quietly into the back of the room, listened closely. Mr. Johnson took a slow step forward. "Respect," he said, "isn't about how loud you speak or how important you look. It's not about money, fame, or fancy titles. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching." He paused, letting his words settle into their young minds. Every person you meet, every classmate, every farmer, every stranger, carries a story you don't know. Some carry dreams bigger than mountains. Others carry pain so deep they can't even speak of it. But they all deserve respect. He looked at Caleb now, his eyes proud but tender. Yesterday, this young man was made to feel small. Today, he reminded us all what strength really looks like. True strength isn't in power. It's in patience, kindness, and forgiveness. Caleb lowered his head, shy but smiling. The students around him glanced at each other, ashamed of their laughter from the day before. Mr. Johnson smiled gently. "Let me tell you a secret," he continued, his voice lowering. "When I was flying in the Air Force, I met people from all over the world, different skin colors, languages, beliefs. But up there in the sky, none of that mattered. We were all the same, all fighting for something bigger than ourselves. Respect kept us together. Without it, we would have fallen apart." He walked slowly across the room, stopping near Mrs. Parker's desk. "That's why I came here today. Not to show a helicopter, not to make a point, but to remind us that every time we speak, every word we say can either lift someone up or tear them down." Mrs. Parker's eyes were wet again. She whispered, "You've lifted us all today, Mr. Johnson." He smiled humbly. "Maybe. But what really matters is what you do after I leave. The real test of respect doesn't happen in front of others. It happens when no one's looking." The principal, standing by the door, cleared his throat quietly. "Mr. Johnson," he said with a kind smile, "would you be willing to share your message with the entire school? I think everyone needs to hear this." Mr. Johnson hesitated, glancing at Caleb. "Only if my grandson doesn't mind." Caleb looked stunned. "Me? Grandpa, Mr. Johnson chuckled softly. "You'll stand right next to me, son. After all, this lesson started with you." A few minutes later, the entire school gathered in the gym. The echo of footsteps filled the space as rows of students and teachers sat on the bleachers. The helicopter outside could still be seen through the wide windows, glimmering in the sunlight like a symbol of something extraordinary. When Mr. Johnson walked to the center of the floor, the room fell silent. He placed one hand on Caleb's shoulder and began, "My name is Samuel Johnson. Some of you might have seen my helicopter land this morning, but that's not what this is about." A faint smile crossed his face. "It's about this young man right here and my grandson. Yesterday he was laughed at for being a farm boy. But let me tell you something. Every farmer, every worker, every person who wakes up early and gives their best, they are the backbone of this world." Murmurs of agreement spread across the crowd. Some teachers nodded quietly. He continued, "You see, respect isn't something you give to people because of what they have. It's something you give because of who they are, a human being. The soil, the sweat, the effort, all of it deserves dignity." Caleb glanced up at his grandfather, his heart swelling with pride. Mr. Johnson raised his hand slightly, his voice strong now. "If you remember nothing else from today, remember this. Greatness doesn't wear expensive shoes or shiny clothes. Sometimes greatness wears muddy boots and carries lunch in a paper bag." The gym erupted in applause, Loud, honest, emotional. Even the teachers joined in. Mrs. Parker wiped her eyes quietly, clapping harder than anyone else. Caleb stood next to his grandfather, overwhelmed. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. Everyone could see it in his eyes, gratitude, hope, and newfound confidence. Mr. Johnson smiled and waved lightly. Thank you all for listening. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it means everything. As the applause rose again, echoing through the gym, the lesson of the day wasn't just about manners, it was about humanity. When Mr. Johnson and Caleb walked out side by side, the sun outside was golden and warm. The helicopter waited, gleaming on the field. But this time it wasn't just a machine, it was a reminder of something deeper. A reminder that sometimes, one act of courage, one simple apology, and one powerful truth can teach an entire town what it really means to respect one another. The next morning, the school felt different. It wasn't louder or busier, just different. The usual laughter, the running feet, the chattering in the hallways, all of it carried a softer, more thoughtful tone. Something had shifted. Caleb walked through the school gates quietly, his backpack slung over one shoulder. For the first time since he had started here, no one laughed. No one whispered behind his back. Instead, the students smiled at him, genuinely. Some nodded, others waved. A few even said, "Hey, Caleb," he wasn't used to it. It felt strange but warm, like stepping into sunlight after days of rain. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Parker stood by her desk, waiting. When Caleb entered, she smiled, a real gentle smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, Caleb," she said softly. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied, trying not to look too surprised. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I wanted to thank you, and your grandfather, for what you both taught us yesterday. It was a lesson I'll never forget." Caleb smiled shyly. He said you were really brave to apologize, ma'am." Mrs. Parker blinked quickly, touched by his kindness. "Your grandfather is a wise man," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "And I think you take after him more than you realize." Caleb looked down, his cheeks warm. For the first time, he felt proud. Not because of the helicopter or the speech, but because people finally saw him for who he was. When the bell rang, the class started as usual, but even that felt different. Mrs. Parker encouraged everyone to share something about where they came from, their family, their traditions, their lives. The stories were beautiful and raw. One student talked about her mother who worked double shifts at a hospital. Another spoke of his father fixing cars late into the night, and when it was Caleb's turn, he stood up, nervous but steady. "My family runs a farm," he began. "We grow corn, raise chickens, and take care of the land. It's hard work, but my grandpa says the land teaches you everything, and patience, respect, and love, and..." I think he's right. The class clapped softly, not out of politeness, but out of genuine admiration. For once, Caleb didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. Later that day, during lunch, a group of students invited him to sit with them. Jake, the boy who used to tease him, was the first to speak. "Hey, Caleb," he said, scratching his head awkwardly. "Your grandpa's like the coolest guy ever." Caleb laughed. "Yeah, he's something." Jake looked serious for a moment. "Hey, I'm sorry for being a jerk before." Caleb shrugged. "It's okay." "No, really," Jake insisted. "I mean it." "You didn't deserve that." Caleb smiled. "Thanks." They ate together after that, laughing and talking like they'd known each other forever. By the time lunch was over, Caleb wasn't just the farm kid anymore, he was just Caleb. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields golden, Caleb sat on the porch with his grandfather. The helicopter was gone now, resting back in its hangar, but its echo still lingered in everyone's hearts. Mr. Johnson sipped his tea quietly, watching the horizon. "So," he said with a little smile, "how was school today?" Caleb grinned. "Different, better." Mr. Johnson chuckled. "I thought it might be." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of crickets filling the warm evening air. Then Caleb asked softly, "Grandpa, did you really land that helicopter just to teach them a lesson?" Mr. Johnson turned to him, his eyes kind and shining. "No, son. I landed it to remind them, and you, that you never let anyone decide your worth. Sometimes people need to see something big to understand something small." Caleb nodded slowly, his heart full. "I think they understood." The old man smiled. "Good. Then my job's done. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the sky where the stars were beginning to appear. You know, Caleb, life will test you again. People will doubt you, maybe even laugh. But every time that happens, just remember, your roots are deep, and your wings are ready. Caleb smiled softly, repeating the words in his mind, roots and wings. The sound of the wind brushing through the fields carried the scent of soil and hope. The house lights glowed warm against the night. Back at school, the story of that day spread far beyond the classrooms. Parents talked about it at dinner tables. Teachers used it as an example in lessons. Even the local newspaper ran a small piece titled, "Helicopter on the Field, a Lesson in Respect." But for Caleb and his grandfather, it wasn't about headlines or applause. It was about something simpler, the quiet victory of dignity. Months later, when a new student joined the school, shy, poor, and unsure, Caleb was the first to sit beside him. "Don't worry," he said with a smile. "You'll be fine here." And in that moment, without even realizing it, Caleb became exactly what his grandfather had hoped for. Not just a boy from a farm, but a young man who understood the true meaning of respect. Because sometimes one act of courage, one apology, and one helicopter landing can change not just a day, but the hearts of everyone who witnesses it.